I met her in the mountains. As an outdoorsy sort of person, I always enjoyed hiking the various mountain trails of my home state, admiring the natural beauty of the sheer stone cliffs, steep canyons carved by churning rivers, and towering trees jutting out of seemingly solid stone. However, while I frequently hiked the lower parts of the mountains, I had never actually camped out overnight, nor hiked in the areas without clearly traveled trails before. And so, last summer, I decided to change that. The drive to the campsite took 4 hours, but the time flew by because the view was as breathtaking as any of the hiking trips I'd taken before. The old dirt road weaved its way up the mountains. A tiny metal barrier was the only thing between the road and a deep chasm. The chasm had once been the site of a raging river, but several years earlier a dam had been built high up in the mountains. Something to do with trying to open up a new gold mine, I remember reading, though nothing ever came of it. Now, the jagged stone cliffs, pockmarked with mysterious cave entrances, overlooked what felt to me like my own personal Grand Canyon. I parked the car in the parking lot, really nothing more than a small flat field of dirt surrounded by an old wooden fence, and unpacked my tent. I noticed a single other car parked nearby, which surprised me. I had chosen a very out-of-the-way, little-known site, and had actually expected to be here entirely on my own. Admittedly, however, the idea of sharing the campsite with someone else did have an appeal. Namely, the appeal of strength in numbers in case of a bear attack. It was another 5-minute walk to the campsite, which I discovered consisted of a small grassy field divided into small sections by little lines of round stone. Each section had a small fire pit and a metal sign warning that bears are attracted to food. Most of the area was quite overgrown with weeds. I noticed one tent already pitched, like mine. It was clearly a one-person affair. I selected a spot of my own to pitch my tent, found a place to put my cooler, and went for a small walk around the immediate vicinity. When I returned, it was already getting dark. The sky was filled with glittering stars, clearly visible without the light pollution of the cities. If I squinted, I could even see the Milky Way itself. The resident of the other tent had returned as well, a young woman with straight black hair that reached her shoulders. She looked up at me as I arrived, making brief eye contact. Her right eye was a strange, deep purple, and her left eye was concealed behind a large black eye patch. She nodded briefly at me, then crawled inside of her tent, and I did the same. I was asleep almost before I finished crawling into my sleeping bag. And then I woke up to the smell of something burning. Pushing out of my tent, I was greeted by the sight of the girl staring at her fire pit with an expression of anger. The smell was coming from the smoldering remains of something in the fire pit. Hearing the sound of my tent flap, she turned to look at me.
"Oatmeal,"
she said, glancing at the blackened, smoky mess in front of her. "Doesn't look like it worked out," I said. She shook her head.
"It didn't."
I offered her some granola bars from my backpack, which she accepted. After checking to be sure that the oatmeal had been properly extinguished, I ate as well. We spoke a bit as we ate. She introduced herself to me as Haley Vector, a student of astronomy at the state college. She was an avid camper, but this was her first time camping solo. She made sure to emphasize that she normally cooked for herself just fine. I suspected she was a little embarrassed about the oatmeal. I told her that while I wasn't very knowledgeable about astronomy, I was majoring in physics myself, and found astronomy fascinating. Haley, in turn, exhibited a strong interest in physics. The conversation continued once we had finished eating, and before long, we had agreed to continue the discussion while hiking. While I examined the map I had brought, looking for a good trail, Haley simply picked a direction and began walking.
"This feels like a good path,"
she said, idly fidgeting with her eye patch. I did my best to avoid staring at it.
"Don't worry,"
she said.
"I'm used to people wondering about it."
Sorry. She shrugged.
"It's normal to be curious. Don't worry about it."
We hiked for several hours, occasionally taking rests under a tree or atop a rock formation whenever we started to tire. While the route Haley had selected seemed to be pure wilderness, as we walked, I began to notice faint traces of a walking trail, not long overgrown. The path was sprinkled with wood chips, like someone had tried to stop the grass from growing, but nature won out in the end. Around noon, we stopped below a dead evergreen for lunch. We had gotten quite high up, and the air was beginning to thin. Haley took a long drink from her water bottle, and I did the same. I'd learned from experience how easily you can get dehydrated at a high altitude. Haley removed something from her backpack, one of those crustless peanut butter and jelly sandwiches you see at the grocery store, and leaned back under the tree to eat. For myself, I ate a protein bar. The storm began suddenly. One minute we were eating our lunch in peace. The next, the sky opened up and Haley and I both dove for shelter beneath the tree, but quickly found ourselves drenched.
We need proper shelter,
Haley muttered, her words partly drowned out. I nodded in agreement. Glancing around, I saw a small crevice on the side of the mountain. I gestured to it, and Haley nodded. We made a mad dash for the crevice, stopping at the entrance to check if any snakes or mountain lions were waiting just inside, and then we ducked in. Huh. Bigger than I expected, I commented. Indeed, the crevice seemed to be an entrance to an entire cave, and a strange chill came over me.
Old.
Haley muttered. What?
This is an old place,
she said. That didn't clarify. Well, yeah, caves are old. She shook her head.
That's not what I mean. Never mind.
Whatever she was thinking, she wasn't interested in sharing with me. I rummaged through my pack and located my flashlight. Well, if we can't hike, maybe we can look around here. Haley gave me an odd look.
Did you notice?
Notice what?
The trail we were following. It was leading here.
I had not noticed. Maybe other people went caving here? She shrugged.
Maybe.
I flicked the flashlight on and shone it around. The cave was much larger than I had first thought. Jagged chunks of rock were scattered around, but the cavern was surprisingly empty. On several sides, small side paths branched out, leading away into the darkness. My light reflected off something strange on one of the far walls. Moving to examine it, I saw that the wall had some sort of symbol painted on it. What do you think this is? Haley came up behind me and examined it.
Looks kinda like a deer,
she said. It looked more like a tree to me. Haley brushed past me and entered the tunnel. Wait, I said, following her. What if there's a mountain lion or something in there?
There isn't.
She looked at me, her expression unreadable in the shadows.
But I feel we need to go this way.
She began to walk once more. A bit concerned, I followed behind her. The tunnel grew slowly narrower as we went deeper. Haley's thin frame fit easily, but I scraped myself against sharp outcroppings a few times. Even so, we continued forward, as though pulled by some invisible string. The air grew colder and colder, and before long, the sole light source was my flashlight. Eventually, the tunnel narrowed to a point we had to remove our packs and continue without. I'm still not sure why we continued. I suppose I couldn't let myself just abandon Haley, and she clearly felt a strong need to press forward. I wish I'd refused, insisted we go back. I wish I hadn't seen what awaited. I didn't know how much time passed before the tunnel began to widen again. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, as we pushed through the last outcropping and into another wide chamber. Flicking the flashlight around, I saw the walls were covered in carvings. The stones around us were carved into primitive stools and tables, and what seemed to be pottery shards coated the floor. My awe was short-lived. The beam of light landed on Haley, and I nearly dropped the flashlight in shock. Her already pale skin was pure white, dripping with sweat. Her right eye was darting around anxiously, and her left hand was clasped over her eye patch. Haley? She shook her head.
Back in the tunnel.
What?
Get back in the tunnel!
She hissed. There was an animal undercurrent to her voice. I stumbled back to the tunnel, but as I neared it, there was a sudden shaking. I barely had time to stumble away before a huge stone slab fell from the ceiling, blocking the entrance to the tunnel. I panicked and struggled back to my feet and ran for the slab, then stopped as the light illuminated it more fully. The entirety of the slab was wrapped in thick black hair. Human hair. I felt bile rise in my throat as I staggered away from the slab.
I'm sorry. This was a mistake.
Haley muttered. I looked at her blankly, my thoughts spiraling into a mass of incoherence.
They've noticed us.
As Haley spoke, faint lights appeared in the corners of my vision. At first, I thought the panic was causing me to see spots, then the light moved closer and took form. Human shapes with hollow eyes and mouths contorted into expression of utmost agony. Some were twisted, their limbs and bodies mutilated and bent into impossible or shattered positions, as though crushed beneath massive stones. Some were like horrible twins, bodies fused together into a writhing mass of torment. They approached from all sides, slowly but surely, their translucent arms grasping for us.
Run!
Haley yelled, the noise shattering the silence. She was already darting for the nearest tunnel. The sound snapped me out of my panicked trance, and I ran after her at a speed I didn't know I was capable of as the figure suddenly surged forward. I dove into the side tunnel and scrambled forward, not even noticing all the sharp rocks slashing through my flesh. The flashlight hit the ground with a loud crack, and the darkness became total.
This way.
Haley's voice came from nearby. I felt her take my hand. She was cold and shaking. I'm sure I was too. We moved cautiously but quickly, unsure if the horrible specters were following us, and unwilling to look back. The darkness was absolute. The colored spots began to fill my vision, and my eyes searched for light where there was none. I felt a moment of weightlessness as the ground gave way, then there was a sharp pain and a bright flash, and then nothing. I didn't know how long I was unconscious. Probably only a few seconds. But it felt like hours. Haley? Haley? I tried to say. I slowly struggled to a sitting position. I couldn't make anything out in the blackness, but feeling around, I could tell we had landed in another cavern. Since none of my bones were broken, we probably hadn't fallen too far. Are you okay? I managed to gasp out.
As much as I can be,
came the reply. I heard a shuffling sound as Haley found her feet.
This was a terrible idea,
she muttered.
Sorry.
It's not your fault, I replied.
I know,
she groaned as she forced herself to a standing position. Do you have a flashlight?
No.
I felt a sudden sinking feeling. Even if those things had stopped following us, we were trapped in the depths of a mountain with no light. It was a feeling of all-encompassing doom. The sure knowledge that I was going to die, entombed beneath countless tons of stone, with nobody to ever know my fate.
It can't be helped, I guess.
Haley sighed. I heard the sound of shuffling cloth, and suddenly there was light. A strange glow filled the tunnel, an impossible mix of orange and purple light. It was dim, but enough that I could make out the shapes of stones around us. And more importantly, I could see that the tunnel continued, slowly sloping upwards. That might be our way out. Haley was already ahead, making her way towards the tunnel. As I began to follow behind her, a realization suddenly hit me. Haley didn't have a light source. Her eye patch flapped around loosely in her right hand. The purple and orange glow was emanating directly from her left eye.